My father was buried on a Tuesday in October, and the ground was already too hard for the gravedigger's liking. They had used a small machine that morning to break the topsoil, and you could still see where the teeth had bitten the clay. I stood at the edge of the open grave with my hand on the rough wood of the casket, and I listened to the wind move through the maples on the hill behind the cemetery. The leaves were the color of rust and old gold, and they were falling in soft handfuls every time the wind turned. I was 58 years old that autumn, and I had spent the last week trying to remember the sound of my father's voice and finding only pieces of it. My brother stood across the grave from me. His name does not matter to this story. What matters is the way he looked at me over the polished pine of the casket. He was 4 years younger than I was, 54 that fall, and he had grown into a stocky man with a balding crown and a hard, pale blue stare. He wore a charcoal half-zip pullover over a white shirt that had been ironed too sharp, and his dark slacks were creased like he had pressed them himself the night before. He glanced at me once, and only once, while the minister spoke. It was not a glance of grief. It was the kind of glance a man gives a closed door when he is already deciding how to open it. I did not look at him long. I looked instead at the casket and at the small silver wedding band I had worn on a chain at my throat for 9 years, since my husband had passed. I held the chain through my cream cotton blouse, the way I always did when something hard was happening, and I tried to remember to breathe. The minister read from the 8th Psalm. The wind kept moving in the maples. My father had asked years before to be buried in this little hillside cemetery above the valley because his own father lay here, and his grandfather, and a great-grandmother who had crossed the ocean from County Tyrone with a baby on her hip in 1851. When the minister closed his book, the wind stopped for a moment, the way it sometimes does in Pennsylvania in October, like the whole hollow is listening. After the service, my brother walked straight to his pickup truck without speaking to anyone. He did not shake the minister's hand. He did not stop to thank our father's old foreman, who had driven down from the upper pasture in his rusted Ford to pay his respects. He did not look at me again. He simply got into his truck, started the engine, and drove down the gravel road toward the farmhouse. I watched the brake lights flicker once at the bottom of the hill where the road turned, and then he was gone behind the trees. I drove home alone. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long lane lined with sugar maples, and the lane was carpeted in fallen leaves that morning, so thick you could not hear the gravel under the tires. The house itself was a 1920s white-painted clapboard with dark green shutters and a wraparound porch set in 142 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland on the slow western shoulder of an Appalachian valley. My grandfather had built the porch with his own hands in 1924. My father had repainted it every 5 years of his life. I had grown up on that porch. I had learned to read on that porch, sitting in a wicker chair with a quilt over my legs, while my mother shelled peas into a yellow bowl. When I came up the lane that afternoon, I saw my brother's truck already parked in the gravel turnaround in front of the porch. The driver's side door was open. He was standing on the porch with his hands on his hips, and he was waiting for me. I parked. I sat in the cab for a moment with the engine off, and I made myself put one hand on the steering wheel and one hand on the chain at my throat and breathe in slowly. Then I got out. He spoke before I reached the steps. He said, "We need to talk about the land." I said, "Today, we just buried him." He said, "Today is exactly the day. Come inside." I followed him into the front parlor. The parlor still smelled the way it always had, of wood smoke from the iron stove and old varnish from the floors, and the faint sweetness of the pipe tobacco my father had used for 50 years and never quite given up. My brother went straight to the roll-top desk in the corner. He pulled a folded yellowed paper from his inside coat pocket and laid it on the desk and smoothed it flat with the heel of his hand. He said, "This is a deed." I said, "I can see that it is a deed." He said, "It is the deed Dad signed in 1989, transferring the entire farm to me, the whole 142 acres, house, barn, west pasture, woodlot, the creek bottom, all of it. He signed it the year I turned 18. He told me then that the land was my birthright as the son. I was waiting until he passed to tell you, because I did not want to upset him." I stood very still. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking through the open parlor door. I could hear a single crow somewhere out in the yard. I could hear my own heart, which was a slower thing than I expected it to be. I said, "May I see it?" He said, "You may look. Do not touch." I bent over the desk and I looked at the paper. It was yellowed, but the yellowing was uneven, and the edges had been browned the way you brown the edges of a school project with a wet tea bag. The paper itself was a printed deed transfer form of the kind any office supply store carried. The date in the top corner read September 14th, 1989. The grantor's signature at the bottom was my father's name in something close to my father's handwriting, but not exactly his handwriting. My father had a particular way of crossing the lower loop of his capital J, and the J on this paper did not have it. There was a notary's stamp in the lower right corner. The notary's name was unfamiliar to me. The seal was crisp, almost too crisp. I straightened up. I said, "I would like a copy." He said, "You will get a copy when the lawyer says you get a copy. The original stays with me." I said, "Where has this paper been for the last 37 years? He said, "In my safe." I said, "Why was it never recorded at the county courthouse?" His jaw worked. He said, "Dad asked me not to record it until he was gone. He said he did not want to upset you." I said, "I am not upset." He said, "You will be." I left the parlor. I walked through the kitchen and out the back door onto the porch, and down the porch steps into the yard. I walked all the way across the yard and through the gate in the split-rail fence and into the west pasture, where the grass was tall and yellow and full of late-season clover, and I stood in the middle of that pasture with my hands at my sides, and I made myself breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6, the way my husband had taught me to do when I was angry, before he died. I did this 12 times. Then I walked back to the house. I told my brother I would consult my own attorney. He told me to suit myself. He told me he was already preparing to move into the master bedroom. He told me that as the new owner, he expected me out of the farmhouse within 30 days. I did not argue with him. I went up the stairs to the small east bedroom that had been mine as a girl, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the cream cotton blouse I had worn to bury my father, and I did not cry. I have never been a woman who cries when she ought to fight. That night I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on and a stack of papers in front of me. The stack was made up of every document I had been able to find in my father's filing cabinets in the 3 days since he died. Tax assessments from the 1970s, crop insurance forms, a binder full of canceled checks from a feed mill that had closed in 1992, receipts for fence wire, and, near the bottom of the stack, in a manila folder labeled in my mother's careful hand, a photocopy of a much older deed. The folder was labeled Partition 1962. I had never seen this folder before. My mother had filed it in the back of the third drawer, behind a hanging rack of recipe cards. I opened it. Inside there was a photocopy, faint but readable, of a deed of partition recorded at the county courthouse on April 3, 1962. It described the division of the family farm between my grandfather and his only sibling, my great-uncle, who had moved away to Pittsburgh and had no further interest in the property. The deed described the boundary in the language deed's use, by metes and bounds, beginning at an iron stake set in the western fence line, at a point 112 feet south of the Great Elm. The deed assigned 60% of the original tract to my grandfather and 40% to my great-uncle. The grandfather's share was the share that had passed to my father. The great-uncle's share, according to a small, handwritten note clipped to the back of the photocopy in my father's writing, had been bought back into the family in 1971, but had been bought back in my name. In my name, not in my father's name, not in the family's name as a whole, in mine as the eldest child, on the day after my 3rd birthday. My father had paid the great-uncle out of his own savings, and he had recorded the title in my name, and he had never told me. I sat at the kitchen table and I read that handwritten note 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Then I put my forehead down on my crossed forearms and I let myself cry, because I had not cried at the grave, and because the kitchen was empty, and because my father, who had never been a sentimental man in his life, had given me the largest gift he was ever going to give me, 45 years. Before his death, and had never said a word about it. When I lifted my head, the lamp was still on, and the kitchen clock said 2:15 in the morning. I folded the photocopy carefully and put it back in the manila folder, and put the manila folder inside a larger envelope, and walked the envelope upstairs and slid it under the mattress of the small east bedroom that had been mine as a girl. Then I went to bed in my clothes and slept 3 hours. In the morning, I drove into town to see the only attorney I trusted, a woman in her early 60s who had handled my husband's estate. Her office was over the hardware store on Main Street, up a narrow wooden staircase that creaked at the 3rd step. I sat across from her oak desk, and I told her everything. The forged-looking deed, the unfamiliar notary, the folder marked Partition 1962, the handwritten note, the 40% bought back into my name in 1971. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk, and she said, 2 things. First, we are going to pull the deed history at the county recorder's office today. Every document filed against that parcel since 1900. Second, before we file anything, before we accuse anyone of anything, you are going to hire a county-licensed surveyor to walk that western fence line and find the iron stake the 1962 deed names. If that stake is still there, and if it sits where the 1962 deed says it sits, your brother's 1989 paper is not worth the ink it was forged in. The 1962 partition predates it by 27 years. And if the 1971 transfer back into your name is recorded, and I expect it is, then 60% of that farm has been legally yours since you were 3 years old. I said, "Do you think the stake is still there?" She said, "Iron stakes set deep in 1962 by a country surveyor with a sledgehammer in clay soil tend to stay where they are put, especially under a fence line that has not been disturbed. Yes, I think the stake is still there. Hire the surveyor today." I hired him that afternoon. He was a 49-year-old man with a lean, tall build and a neat sandy beard and kind gray eyes behind clear safety glasses, and he came recommended by the county recorder herself when I asked who in the valley still knew how to read a 1962 deed. His shop was a small block building behind the feed store, and the front window had a hand-painted sign that read Surveys, Boundary Disputes, Elevations. He listened to me describe what I needed, and when I told him the date of the deed, he set down his coffee cup and looked at me with new attention. He said, 1962, iron stake, western fence line, 112 feet south of a great elm. I said, yes. He said, ma'am, the man who set that stake was my grandfather. He was the licensed surveyor in this valley from 1948 until 1979. I have his field books in a metal cabinet in the back room. I can have the original notes in front of me in 20 minutes. I will be on your fence line at first light tomorrow. I cannot describe to you what it felt like to hear that. I sat in his small front office and I looked at the hand-painted sign in the window from the inside, and I felt the world reach out and take my hand in a way it had not taken my hand in a very long time. My father was dead. My brother was sleeping in the master bedroom of the house I had grown up in. And here, in this small block building behind the feed store, a man I had never met before was telling me that his grandfather's careful work, done with a steel tape and a sledgehammer and a hand level in the spring of 1962, was about to come back out of the ground and answer for me. He came out at 6 the next morning. The sun was not yet up. There was a heavy autumn mist over the field, the kind of mist that hangs at knee height and makes the grass look like the surface of a lake. He set up his transit on its tripod near the old apple tree at the corner of the yard, and he walked the western fence line on foot, with a steel rod in one hand and a notebook in the other, counting paces, stopping, looking up at the great elm, counting again. The elm itself had grown enormously since 1962, but its trunk was still in the same place, and its place was the place the deed named. I walked beside him. I did not speak. He did not speak either. Once or twice he stopped and pushed his hard hat back and looked across the field, then looked at his notebook, then nodded to himself and walked on. After about 35 minutes, he stopped at a particular fence post, a weathered cedar post that leaned a little to the south, and he knelt down in the tall yellow grass, and he set his hand on the soil at the base of the post. He said, "Ma'am, bring me the small trowel from the truck, please." I brought the trowel. He took it without looking up. He began to brush the soil away from the base of the post, in slow, careful strokes. He did not dig. He brushed. He worked for perhaps 3 minutes that way, and then his hand stopped, and he set the trowel down, and he reached into the soil with 2 fingers and tapped on something hard. He said, "There she is." He spent another 10 minutes working the soil away, and when he was done, there was an iron stake about 2.5 inches square, driven flush into the ground, with a faint, hand-stamped mark on its top. The mark was a small letter R inside a circle, his grandfather's mark. The stake itself was rusted on the outside but solid in the core, and it sat exactly 112 feet south of the great elm. He measured the distance twice with his steel tape, and twice he wrote the same number in his notebook. He looked up at me. He said, "Ma'am, this stake has not been moved since 1962. The soil profile around it is undisturbed. There is no replacement collar, no fresh fill, no second cut of the post. This is the original boundary monument, named in the partition deed of April 3rd, 1962. The line it marks runs from this point, on a bearing of north 12 degrees east, to the next monument at the upper corner of the woodlot. I will produce a sealed certified survey within 7 days. I did not say anything. I could not. Could. I stood in the wet grass with the mist around my knees, and I looked at the small iron square in the ground, and I thought of my grandfather, and of my grandfather's surveyor, and of my father walking this same fence line as a young man in 1971 with a check in his pocket to buy back his brother's share in my name. And I thought of how every one of these men had done a small, careful thing in his time, and how those small, careful things had been waiting in the soil for 64 years for a woman in a denim jacket to come and need them. The certified survey arrived 7 days later. It was a single large sheet, folded in thirds, sealed with the surveyor's embossed stamp, and signed in blue ink. It plotted the iron stake at coordinates that matched the 1962 partition deed within 1 inch. It showed the boundary line running north 12 degrees east. It showed the 60-40 division. It was, my attorney told me on the phone that afternoon, ironclad. The next morning, my attorney and I drove to the county courthouse together, and we pulled every document filed against that parcel since 1900. There were 43 of them. The 1962 partition deed was there, recorded April 3rd of that year, exactly as the photocopy in my mother's folder had shown. The 1971 transfer was there too, recorded May 11th, 1971, transferring the great-uncle's 40% share into my name as a minor child, with my father acting as my guardian. It had been sitting in the recorder's books for 55 years. Anyone who had bothered to look could have found it. My brother, apparently, had never bothered to look. The 1989 deed my brother was waving around was not in the recorder's books. Not in 1989. Not in any year. It had never been recorded. There was no record of the notary on the seal having held a commission in this county or any neighboring county in 1989. The state notary database, which my attorney pulled up on her laptop in the recorder's office, showed no commission for that name in 1989, 1988, 1987, or 1990. No commission ever. My attorney closed the laptop and looked at me. She said, "Your brother has handed you the rope." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means he is not just wrong. He is criminally wrong. Producing a forged deed with a forged notary seal is a felony in this state. We are not going to file a criminal complaint today. We are going to give him one chance to walk away. But we are going to file a quiet title action this afternoon, and we are going to attach the certified survey, and we are going to attach the recorded 1962 partition deed, and we are going to attach the recorded 1971 transfer into your name, and we are going to attach the state notary search showing his notary never existed. By the end of this week, every judge in this county is going to know exactly what happened on your father's farm, and your brother is going to know it too. We filed that afternoon. The papers were served on him at the farmhouse the next morning. I was not there. I had moved into the small apartment over my attorney's office while the case was pending, because my attorney did not want me sleeping under the same roof as a man who was about to be served with a quiet title action and the implicit threat of a felony forgery referral. I sat at the kitchenette table in that little apartment, and I drank a cup of black coffee, and I watched the maples on Main Street drop their leaves one by one onto the brick sidewalk, and I waited. He called me at 4 in the afternoon. His voice was different. The bark was gone. The hard, pale blue stare did not carry through a phone line. He said, "We need to talk." I said, "Talk to my attorney." He said, "I am talking to my sister." I said, "Then do it through my attorney." He hung up. He called my attorney within the hour. My attorney called me back at 6. She said, "He says he found the 1989 deed in your father's papers after the funeral. He says he believed it was real. He says he had no idea about the 1962 partition or the 1971 transfer. He is asking us to consider not pursuing the criminal angle." I said, "Do you believe him?" She said, "I believe a piece of him believes himself. That is the most generous thing I can say." I said, "What does he want?" She said, "He wants a settlement. He says he will sign over any claim to your 60% if you will let him keep his 40% in peace, and if you will not pursue criminal charges against him for the forgery." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. I looked out the kitchenette window at the maples on Main Street. I thought about my father, who would not have wanted his son to go to prison, no matter what his son had done. I thought about my mother, who had filed that manila folder in the back of the third drawer in 1962, and had labeled it in her careful hand, and had never said a word about it for the rest of her life, because she trusted that the truth would keep. I thought about the surveyor's grandfather, who had hammered that stake into the soil 64 years ago, and trusted that the iron would keep, too. I said, "Tell him this. He keeps his 40%. He never sets foot on my 60% again without my written invitation. He returns the 1989 forgery to us, the original by hand, by Friday. He pays the surveyor's fee out of his own pocket, and he writes a letter in his own handwriting acknowledging that the 1989 deed was not signed by our father. The letter goes into a sealed envelope in your office safe. If he ever raises a claim against my 60% again, the letter comes out. That is the deal. No criminal referral, but the letter exists forever." My attorney was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That is a better deal than he deserves." I said, "He is my brother." She said, "I know. That is why I am writing it up." He signed within 48 hours. He brought the original 1989 forgery to my attorney's office on Friday afternoon, in the same folded yellowed condition I had first seen it in, and he laid it on her desk without saying a word. He wrote the letter in her conference room with the door closed. When he came out, he did not look at me, although I was sitting in the front waiting room. He walked past me and down the creaking wooden staircase and out onto Main Street, and he got into his pickup truck and he drove away. I did not see him again for almost a year. The quiet title action was finalized in court on the second Wednesday of December. The judge, an old man with white eyebrows and a slow, careful voice, read the certified survey aloud into the record. He read the 1962 partition deed aloud. He read the 1971 transfer aloud. He looked over the top of his glasses at the empty seat where my brother could have appeared but had not, and he said, "The court finds no genuine dispute. Title to 60% of the parcel, known as the family farm, comprising approximately 85.2 acres, is quieted in the name of the petitioner, the eldest daughter of the late grantor, retroactive to May 11th, 1971. The remaining 40% is held by the respondent, the younger son, by separate instrument. So ordered." I walked out of the courthouse into the December cold, and I stood on the granite steps for a long time. The sky was that low, pale gray color the Pennsylvania sky gets in December, and there was a thin, dry snow blowing across the courthouse square, and I could feel the silver wedding band on its chain, pressing cold against my skin through the cream cotton blouse. I thought of my husband. I thought of my father. I thought of my mother in the kitchen of the farmhouse in 1962, labeling a manila folder in her careful hand. I held the chain at my throat for a long minute, and then I walked down the steps and across the square and over to my pickup, and I drove home. The farmhouse was empty when I came up the lane. My brother had moved out the week before into a rented duplex on the edge of town. The master bedroom door was open and the bed had been stripped. The kitchen still smelled faintly of his coffee. I walked through every room of that house slowly, the way you walk through a room when you have just brought it back from a place you thought you had lost it to. I stood in the parlor where the roll-top desk sat, and I did not touch the desk, but I rested one hand on the doorframe, and I told my father, out loud, that the house was still ours. I told him I was sorry it had taken me 3 months. I told him I had found the folder. The wind moved in the maples outside the parlor window, the same way it had moved at the graveside in October. The whole hollow listened. The first winter I lived in the farmhouse alone, I did not change anything in it. I left the roll-top desk where it had always stood. I left my father's pipe on the small table by the iron stove, although I did not light it. I left my mother's recipe cards in the third drawer of the kitchen cabinet, where she had filed them, behind where the manila folder had been. I cooked simple meals. I read in the wicker chair on the porch in the afternoons when the sun was out, with a quilt over my legs, the way I had as a girl. I walked the lane every evening at dusk, when the maples were bare and the gravel was cold under my boots, and I made it as far as the iron stake on the western fence line and back. The stake itself had been reset, after the survey was certified, by the surveyor's own hand. He had brushed it clean of 64 years of soil. He had wire brushed the rust off the head until the iron underneath shone a soft polished gray. He had driven it back to its original depth, and he had cut the cedar fence post above it just enough to expose the top inch of the stake to the air. He had not charged me extra for that. He had told me, when he handed me the certified survey, that a boundary monument that has done its job ought to be allowed to keep doing it in plain sight, where the light can find it. A year later, in October, on the morning of the first frost, I got up before dawn and I put on my faded denim jacket and my brown work boots, and I walked out across the yard and through the gate in the split-rail fence and out into the west pasture. The mist was on the field at knee height, the way it had been the morning the surveyor came. The leaves of the maples on the hill above the cemetery were the color of rust and old gold. I walked the western boundary slowly, fence post by fence post, the way I had walked beside the surveyor a year before. I counted my paces aloud. I stopped at the leaning cedar post 112 feet south of the great elm. The stake was waiting. The first edge of the sun came up over the ridge to the east, and it ran along the field at a low angle, and it caught the polished iron head of the stake and made it shine for a single bright second, the way the bezel of a watch shines when it catches a window. I knelt down beside the stake. I rested 2 fingers on the cold metal. I did not say anything. I had not come out there to say anything. I had come out there to be present at the place where a small, careful thing had been done in the spring of 1962 by a man I had never met, and where that small, careful thing had waited under the soil for 65 years to be needed, and where it had answered when it had been needed. I stayed kneeling for perhaps 2 minutes. Then I stood up. I brushed the dew off my jeans. I started to walk back toward the farmhouse. I had not gone 20 paces when I heard tires on the gravel of the lane, and I turned, and I saw a small gray sedan I did not recognize coming slowly up the lane between the bare maples. The car stopped in the gravel turnaround in front of the porch. Two young men got out. They were in their middle 20s, both in dark wool jackets and clean work boots, and they stood awkwardly in the gravel with their hands at their sides. They looked at the porch. They looked at the field. They saw me. They lifted their hands in a small, uncertain wave. I knew who they were before they came across the field to meet me. They were my brother's two sons. I had not seen either of them since they were teenagers. The older one had his father's pale blue eyes, but a softer mouth. The younger one had taken after his mother, who had divorced my brother years before. Dark hair, dark eyes, careful hands. They walked to me across the wet grass, with the mist still moving around their knees. And they stopped at the cedar post, where the polished stake caught the dawn. The older one said, "Ma'am, Aunt, we did not mean to interrupt." I said, "You are not interrupting." He said, "We came because we wanted to say something to you. Our father will not say it. He has not been able to say it. We do not know if he ever will be able to say it. But we have known for a year what happened. And we did not want another year to go by without somebody from his side of the family telling you on this ground that we are sorry." The younger one said, "We are sorry." I looked at them for a long moment. I looked at the older one's pale blue eyes that were so much like my brother's and yet so much softer. I looked at the younger one's careful hands. I looked over their shoulders at the white-painted clapboard farmhouse with its dark green shutters and its single light still burning in the upstairs east bedroom where I had slept. And I thought of how a family is not a single thing, but a long, quiet line of small, careful acts done by people who will never meet each other, and how that line had nearly been broken, and how it had not been broken because of an iron stake set in clay soil in the spring of 1962, and a manila folder labeled in 1962, and a check written in 1971, and a deed photocopied and slid into the back of a third drawer where a woman's daughter would find it 45 years later when she needed it. I said, "Come up to the house. I will make coffee." They came. We sat in the kitchen. I put a kettle on the iron stove because the electric one had stopped working in the summer, and I had not bothered to replace it. I poured them coffee in the same yellow mugs my mother had used. The older one asked me if it was true that the stake had been hammered into the ground by his great-great-grandfather's surveyor, and I said it was, and I told him the surveyor's grandson had been the one to find it again, and that the surveyor's grandson lived 12 miles down the valley and would be glad to show him the field books if he ever wanted to see them. The older one wrote the address down in a small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. The younger one drank his coffee in careful, slow sips and said almost nothing, and when he set the empty mug down, he said, "Thank you for the coffee, ma'am," and he meant it. They did not stay long. They had driven up from Pittsburgh that morning before dawn, and they had to drive back. When they left, I walked them out to the car. The older one, before he got in, turned to me and said, "May we come back?" I said, "Yes, come back any time. The lane is open." He said, "Thank you, Aunt." They drove down the lane between the bare maples and out onto the county road, and away. I stood in the gravel turnaround for a long while after they were gone. The sun was up now. The mist was lifting off the field. The polished iron head of the stake at the leaning cedar post was no longer catching the light because the light had moved on and was lying flat across the field in a long sheet of gold. I could see the line of the boundary very clearly from where I stood, even without the stake, because once you have seen a boundary in its truth, you can always see it again. I walked back into the farmhouse. I poured the rest of the coffee into a thermos. I went out to the porch, and I sat in the wicker chair, and I put a quilt over my legs, the way my mother used to do, and I drank my coffee, and I watched the sun come the rest of the way up over the valley. There is a thing I have learned about the truth of land, and the truth of family, and the truth of what is left to a person by the people who came before them. The truth does not shout. The truth does not wave a yellowed paper on a porch in a charcoal pullover with hard, pale blue eyes. The truth lies under the soil at the base of a leaning cedar post, hammered in by a careful man with a sledgehammer in the spring of 1962, and it waits. It will wait 64 years if it has to. It will wait longer than that. It will wait until the right person, on the right morning, with the right small folded paper in her left hand, and the right rolled survey map in her right, walks the fence line at dawn and finds it. I sat on the porch until my coffee was gone. The chain at my throat was warm against my skin in the new sun. Somewhere down the lane, a single crow called once, and the sound of it carried clear across the field. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I listened, and I thought of my father, and I thought of my mother, and I thought of the surveyor's grandfather hammering iron into clay 64 years before I had ever heard of him, and I thought of how all of them had loved me without ever telling me they had, by leaving me a thing in the ground that would speak when I needed it to speak. That was the autumn I learned that an inheritance is not a paper. An inheritance is a careful act done quietly long ago by people who trusted you to find it. And when you find it, you do not shout. You kneel. You put 2 fingers on the cold metal. You stand back up, and you walk the boundary at dawn, every dawn that is given to you after that, for as long as you are given dawns. I am 59 years old now. The farm is mine. 60% of 142 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland in a small Appalachian Valley town. The white clapboard farmhouse with its dark green shutters and its wraparound porch. The split rail fence on the western boundary line. The leaning cedar post 112 feet south of the great elm. The polished iron stake at its base, exposed now to the air, catching the first light of every clear morning. And on the roll-top desk in the parlor, in a small wooden box my husband made for me 30 years ago out of a single piece of black walnut, I keep 3 things. The original 1962 partition deed, in its manila folder, labeled in my mother's careful hand. The 1971 transfer, the one that put the great-uncle's 40% into my name when I was 3 years old. And the certified sealed survey from the day the surveyor knelt in the wet grass and brushed the soil away from the iron stake that had been waiting for me since before I was born. I do not need to look at any of them very often. I only need to know that they are there, in the box, on the desk, in the parlor of the house, and I need to walk the boundary at dawn whenever I can. And I need to leave the lane open, because one morning soon, the older one is going to drive up that lane again with his younger brother in the passenger seat, and they are going to stand in the gravel turnaround in their dark wool jackets, and I am going to wave them up to the porch, and I am going to make coffee on the iron stove, and I am going to walk them out across the yard and through the gate in the split-rail fence and out into the west pasture in the mist, and I am going to take them to the leaning cedar post 112 feet south of the great elm, and I am going to kneel down beside the polished iron stake, and I am going to show them the small letter R inside a circle stamped on the head of it by a man who died long before any of us were born. And I am going to tell them that this is what an inheritance looks like. Not a paper waved on a porch, not a forged signature, not a brother's bark. An iron stake driven deep into Pennsylvania clay in the spring of 1962 by a careful man who trusted that the people who came after him would walk the fence line one day and need it. And I am going to tell them that the line is true, that the line has always been true, that the line will be true after I am gone, and after they are gone, and after their children are gone, because the iron is in the ground, and the deed is in the box, and the box is on the desk, and the desk is in the parlor, and the parlor is in the white-painted farmhouse, with its dark green shutters and its wraparound porch. And the farmhouse stands on land that has been quietly, carefully, lovingly held in trust for me, in the names of people who never said a word about it since the spring of 1962. That is what my father left me. That is what my mother left me. That is what the surveyor's grandfather left me. That is what every careful person in the long, quiet line of my family left me, by doing one small, careful thing at a time and trusting that it would be found. I walk the boundary at dawn. The stake catches the light. The line is true. There are pieces of this story I have not told yet, pieces that I want to set down here on this same page before the light shifts and the day moves on, because they are the small, careful things that held the larger story together, and small, careful things are easy to lose if you do not write them down. The first piece is about my mother. My mother died in the spring of 2011, 11 years before my father, in the same farmhouse where I grew up. She was sick for the better part of a year before she went. The cancer started in her stomach and moved through her slowly, the way certain quiet things move. I came home that whole spring on the weekends, and toward the end, I did not go back to the small town where my husband and I lived at all. I stayed in the small east bedroom that had been mine as a girl, and I cooked simple food for her, and I sat with her in the parlor in the afternoons, while she dozed in the wing-backed chair under a knitted afghan she had made herself in 1973. She did not say very much in that last spring. My mother had never been a woman who said very much. But one afternoon, in the second week of April, when the maples were just beginning to turn that pale yellow-green color that comes before the leaves are really leaves, she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "There is a folder in the third drawer." I did not understand what she meant. I thought she was talking about a recipe. She had been giving me her recipes one by one all that spring, the way some women hand down jewelry. I said, "Which folder, Mama?" And she only smiled at me, the small private smile she had used my whole life when she thought I was being slow about something, and she closed her eyes again. She did not say anything else about a folder for the rest of the day. By evening she was sleeping deeply, and by the next morning she had moved past the place where words could find her. She lived 2 more weeks. She never spoke about a folder again. I forgot about it. I did forget. I forgot it for 11 years. I forgot it through her funeral and through my husband's last illness and through my husband's funeral and through the quiet, hollow years afterward when I worked at the regional library 3 days a week and drove out to the farm on weekends to help my father with whatever needed helping. I forgot it through the long, slow decline of my father's hearing and through the stroke he had in 2019 that took most of his right side, and through the careful, determined years he spent learning to walk again with a cane in his left hand. I forgot it right up until the night I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the stack of papers in front of me, and I opened the manila folder labeled in my mother's careful blue handwriting, and I read what was inside. She had been telling me. She had been telling me, in her quiet way, in April of 2011, where to look when the time came. She had not been able to say the rest of the sentence. She had not had the strength. But she had told me the part she had time to tell, and she had trusted me to remember it. And I had not remembered it for 11 years. And then, on the night I needed it, the words came back to me out of nothing. There is a folder in the third drawer, and I went and I looked, and the folder was there. That is the first piece I wanted to set down. My mother told me about the folder. I did not understand her then. I understood her 11 years later. There is no shame in not understanding what is told to you until you are ready to understand it. There is only the obligation, when you finally do understand, to walk to the third drawer and open it. The second piece is about my father. I did not know my father had bought the great-uncle's 40% share back into my name in 1971 until I read the handwritten note clipped to the photocopy in the manila folder. My father never told me. I want to be honest here, because the honest thing is the only thing worth setting down. My father was not by temperament a generous man. He was a hard man. He was a careful man. He was a man who counted dollars, and he was a man who had grown up during the last years of the Great Depression in a Pennsylvania Valley town where dollars were scarce, and he carried that scarcity in his bones for the rest of his life. He did not give us spending money as children. He did not throw birthday parties. He did not buy my mother flowers, except once, the autumn after their first grandchild was born, and lived only 3 days. He bought her white chrysanthemums that autumn. They were the only flowers I ever saw him buy her. So, when I tell you that my father, in the spring of 1971, 3 years after I was born, took $12,000 out of his savings, which in 1971, on a small Pennsylvania farm, was very nearly all the money he had, and used it to buy his uncle's share of the farm, and recorded that share in my name as a 3-year-old child. I want you to understand what kind of an act this was. It was the largest act of love my father was ever going to perform. He performed it 45 years before his death. He performed it without telling me. He performed it without telling my brother, who was not yet born. He performed it without telling my mother, although I suspect now, looking back, that he must have told her, because how else would she have known where to file the folder? He performed it because he had been my father for 3 years by then, and he had decided in some quiet, careful place inside himself that the land was going to be safe with me when he was gone. He had decided this before he had ever seen me read a book. He had decided it before he knew what kind of woman I was going to grow into. He had decided it on the basis of nothing but the 3 years he had already known me, and he had committed nearly all of his savings to it, and he had recorded it in the courthouse in town, and then he had walked back out of the courthouse onto Main Street, and he had never said a word about it for the next 45 years. I have spent a great deal of time in the last year thinking about why he never told me. I do not believe it was because he wanted to surprise me. My father was not a man who liked surprises. I do not believe it was because he was waiting for the right moment. My father was not a man who believed in right moments. I believe now that he never told me because he wanted the land to come to me on its own merits, when it was needed, through the careful machinery of recorded deeds and county courthouses and iron stakes hammered into clay by careful surveyors. He wanted the land to come to me because the truth of the land said it should come to me, not because my father had told me a story about it. He trusted the truth. He trusted the recorded deed. He trusted the iron in the ground. He trusted, in the end, me, to find what he had left for me when I was ready to find it. That is a kind of love I did not know my father was capable of while he was alive. I know it now. The third piece is about my brother. I have been careful, all through this story, not to give my brother a name. I have done that on purpose. I do not want his name in this story, because his name is not the part of him that matters. What matters is that he is a man who, at the age of 54, with a divorce behind him and 2 grown sons, and a rented duplex on the edge of town, and very little to show for any of it, walked into a stationery store somewhere in this valley sometime in the spring after our father's stroke, and bought a printed deed transfer form, and took it home, and forged our father's signature on it, and forged a notary seal under that, and folded it, and browned its edges with a wet tea bag, and put it in his safe, and waited for our father to die so he could pull it out and wave it on the porch. That is what he did. I do not know exactly when he did it. I do not know exactly how long he sat with it in his safe before he used it. I do not know whether he ever, in the long quiet hours of those years, looked at it in there and felt the smallness of what he was holding. I do not know whether some piece of him knew even then that the iron stake on the western fence line would eventually come out of the ground and answer for me. I will never know any of that. He has never spoken to me about any of it. The letter he wrote in my attorney's conference room is the only document we have from him on the subject, and the letter is sealed in my attorney's office safe and will stay sealed unless he ever comes for the land again, which I do not believe he will. I want to say something honest here, even though the honest thing is the hard thing. I am not proud of him. I will not lie about that. He is my brother, and I love him in the small, dim way you love a person who shares your blood and your earliest memories. But I am not proud of him, and I do not want him in my house. I do not believe I will ever want him in my house again. There is a kind of damage that cannot be repaired only because the person who did it has not yet looked at the damage and named it as his own. My brother has not looked. My brother has not named. Until he does, the line between us is the line of the western fence, the line that runs from the iron stake at 112 feet south of the great elm on a bearing of north 12 degrees east, up to the upper corner of the woodlot, and it is a line I do not expect him to cross. I do, however, want his sons in my house. I want them in my kitchen, drinking coffee out of my mother's yellow mugs. I want them on my porch, in the wicker chair, under a quilt. I want them walking the boundary with me at dawn. They came in October. I expect them again in the spring. The older one writes me a letter every month, on plain ruled paper, in a steady, careful hand, and tells me about his work and his girl and the small apartment he and his brother share in Pittsburgh. The younger one does not write, but he sends me a photograph every now and again, taken on his phone, of something he thought I would want to see. A red-tailed hawk on a fence post outside their building. An old surveyor's transit he saw in the window of a Pittsburgh antique shop. A bowl of stew his brother had made on a Sunday. I keep the letters in a small wooden box on the roll-top desk in the parlor, beside the larger walnut box that holds the deeds. The letters are not part of the inheritance. The letters are the new thing. The letters are what comes after. The fourth piece is about the surveyor. His grandfather, The man who hammered the iron stake into the clay on the western fence line in the spring of 1962 was named. His grandson told me one afternoon when I drove out to his shop with a tin of cookies I had baked, in honor of a careful man who never knew me and yet did me the largest favor of my life. The grandson would not take the cookies at first. He said, "Ma'am, I was paid for the survey." I said, "These are not for the survey. These are for him." He understood then, and he took the tin, and he set it on the counter beside the cash register, and he wiped his eyes with the back of one hand, quickly so I would not see, and he said, "He would have liked you. He used to say the western fence line on your grandfather's place was the prettiest line in the valley. He said it ran like a song." I drove home that day with the late afternoon sun in my eyes, and I thought about what it meant for a careful country surveyor in 1962 to look at a fence line and call it a song. I thought about how a man who could see a fence line that way might also be the kind of man who would hammer an iron stake deeper into the soil than he strictly needed to, just to make sure that the stake would hold for 64 years, if it had to. I thought about how the world is held together, not by the loud people, but by the careful ones. The ones who hammer iron deep. The ones who file folders in the back of third drawers and label them in careful handwriting. The ones who write checks and record deeds and never say a word about it for the rest of their lives. The grandson came to dinner at the farmhouse once that winter, with his wife and their 2 small daughters. The daughters wanted to see the stake. He took them out to the western fence line in their pink coats and red boots, in the snow, with a small flashlight, and he showed them the polished iron square in the ground, and he showed them the small letter R inside a circle on the head of it, and he told them that their great-grandfather had put it there. The older girl, who was 7, asked him whether the stake would still be there when she was a grandmother. He said, "Yes, sweetheart, it will still be there." She thought about this for a moment, and then she said, "Will I be a surveyor?" He said, "If you want to be, you would be a fine one." Then they came back inside, and we ate beef stew in the kitchen with the iron stove burning, and the smaller daughter fell asleep in her father's lap before the cornbread came out of the oven. And I have not, in my whole life, been more grateful for a Sunday than I was for that one. The 5th piece is about myself. I am 59 years old. I am a widow. I have no children. The land that has been in my family for more than 150 years will need, when I am gone, to be left to someone, and I have thought about this almost every day since the quiet title action was finalized in December of last year. I have thought about it on the porch in the wicker chair. I have thought about it at the kitchen table with the lamp on. I have thought about it walking the boundary at dawn. I have not yet decided. I have time. But I think, and I will say this carefully, because it is a thing I am still circling rather than a thing I have settled. I think the land will go to my brother's older son, with a life estate to me and a remainder to him, and a covenant in the deed that the western boundary stake at 112 feet south of the Great Elm shall not be removed, disturbed, or relocated by him or his heirs, or assigns or any subsequent owner, in perpetuity on penalty of forfeiture of the parcel back to the county as conservation easement. The boundary stake will stay. That is the only thing I am certain of. Whatever else happens, whoever else comes to live in the white clapboard farmhouse with its dark green shutters, the iron in the ground will stay. The line will stay true. That is my contribution to the long, quiet line of careful acts. It is not a large contribution, but it is mine, and I will make it. And when I am gone, the people who come after me will walk the fence line at dawn and find the same iron stake my grandfather's surveyor hammered into the clay in the spring of 1962. And they will know that the line has been kept, and they will know what to do. I sit on the porch now. The sun has been up for about an hour. The mist has lifted off the field. The thermos of coffee is empty. The chain at my throat is warm. There is a single crow somewhere down the lane, and a few late maple leaves are still falling, one at a time, onto the porch boards. Yesterday I had a letter from the older son. He says they are coming up next weekend. He says they will stay 2 nights if I will have them. He says his younger brother has been talking about taking the surveyor's licensing course at the community college in Pittsburgh, and he wanted to know whether I thought that was a good idea. I will write him back this afternoon. I will tell him yes. I will tell him to come up. I will tell him I have already made the small east bedroom up for them, and the wood is split for the iron stove, and I will make a beef stew and a cornbread for the Saturday night, and I will walk them out across the yard and through the gate, in the split-rail fence, and out into the west pasture in the mist. And I will take them to the leaning cedar post, 112 feet south of the great elm, and I will kneel down beside the polished iron stake, and I will show them the small letter R inside a circle stamped on the head of it. And I will tell them, both of them, the older one with his father's pale blue eyes and softer mouth, and the younger one with his careful hands, that this is what an inheritance looks like. Not a paper waved on a porch, not a forged signature, not a brother's bark, an iron stake, hammered deep, waiting in the ground, for as long as it has to wait, until the right person walks the fence line at dawn and finds it. The line is true. The line has always been true. The line will be true after I am gone, because the iron is in the ground, and the deed is in the box, and the box is on the desk, and the desk is in the parlor, and the parlor is in the white-painted farmhouse, with its dark green shutters and its wraparound porch, and the farmhouse stands on land that has been quietly, carefully, lovingly held in trust for me, and now, through me, for the careful young men and the careful young women who will come after me, by every quiet, careful person in the long line of my family since the spring of 1962. That is what they left me. That is what I will leave them. I walk the boundary at dawn. The stake catches the light. The line is true. That is the whole story.